Welcome back to Arise America. They are celebrating at the border between Mexico and the United States. Border Patrol agents are finally processing a few women and children from that caravan of asylum seekers after initially turning them away. But this does not mean their requests will be granted. For the survivors of that 2,000-mile trek from Central America, the future is still very much unclear. The caravan is being seen as a challenge to the Trump administration's policy towards people fleeing violence in other countries.
Percentages, but we are a nation of laws. We have to have borders. We don't have borders, we don't have a country. And I've been watching for weeks as the caravan came up. And you know, the Mexican laws are very tough on immigration, extremely tough. And it started out with way over 1,000 people, I guess.
Now, there's no question where the president stands. He is firmly against letting in any of the asylum seekers. Vice President Pence visited California's Border Patrol agents. He was asked, should the U.S. permit entry to anyone from that caravan?
These are individuals, most of whom already have been given refugee status in Mexico, and yet they persist in their attempts to come into the United States. And look, we'll process them under the laws of this country. But the simple reality is that this caravan, and caravans that have come before, are a result of individuals who are attempting to exploit the suffering of people in Central America to try and advance their agenda.
Ernie Collette is a staff attorney with the Mobilization for Justice, and Juan Ruiz is co-founder of the New Sanctuary Coalition. Both organizations work to assist immigrants and asylees seeking protection in the U.S. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we see those developments. It looks partially like good news, but it's not good news for everyone. Before they are allowed to come into the U.S., they have to go through what's called a credible fear interview. What exactly is that?
A credible fear interview is something that was actually determined by the Supreme Court. Effectively, it's sort of a 10% ground that allows an intending asylum applicant to demonstrate credible fear, either past or future persecution, in regards to one of the 5 grounds, which is race, religion, nationality, participation in a particular social group, or political opinion. So it's an opportunity for an individual applicant who's trying to then go to the asylum process to show at the border, or unfortunately if in detention, to an asylum officer that they meet the base level criteria to be able to then apply for asylum and gather information and evidence necessary to then prove their claim.
But for women and children, it's not so easy at all.
Well, what we've been seeing and in fairness, it's not just this administration. We've seen the mechanism of removal, and also the mechanism of this sort of deportation machine in the prior administration as well. What we have seen is, but it's sort of been ramped up to an extreme degree in this administration. There's proposed ideas of separating women and children. Now, the administration, the Department of Homeland Security, has said that's only to potentially determine whether the individual taking the child across the border with them is their actual child. But again, it's the extreme policies that we've seen women and children either together, or the fear of separation, languishing in detention for months longer than required by law to get this credible fear interview to be able to then potentially be let into the United States and allowed to pursue their asylum claim. So there's a lot of hurdles, even more so with this administration.
So you heard what the president and the vice president said. They're firmly against allowing this to come in. What's your initial reaction to that?
Well, first we need to take into consideration that the law is different than justice. Here, most of the people that come to our shores are seeking the justice that many of our countries of origin are denying them. So when they come because of the ideals that have been conveyed to our home countries, and they are basically looking for that American dream still. In the hope of finding that justice that has been denied many times, they come to our shores. So we have to make a difference between that the law has to be guided by this justice that is universal, and that protects the dignity of the person.
In addition, it feels like the vice president was sort of resigned to the idea of, we'll process these individuals, but the reality is it's not an exploitation. A lot of the individuals who are coming and seeking asylum into the United States are coming from countries that have seen massive amounts of gang-based violence, massive amounts of murders and instability, political and systemic corruption and instability. As a result, individuals are fleeing their country not because they want to. I've never met an immigrant applying for asylum or applying for another form of humanitarian relief because they've wanted to. It's because they were forced to, because they couldn't, either through a process of having a matter of survival or having their children survive whatever violence that may be in their country. There's a reason why these humanitarian possibilities are in place, and the United States shouldn't be resigned to preventing these types of relief from happening. They should be welcoming individuals.
There was all this talk about troops being sent to the border. Do you think the caravan has arrived, the troops are in theory there? Did that help this process at all?
The border is already over-militarized. Since we can see the people that are coming into our shores, and it's a trickle. From the past, there was rivers flowing into our shores. Not anymore, not anymore. And that has a lot to do with the over-militarization of our border. This constant reminder that we need to defend our shores, that we need to invest in troops and deploying troops and militarizing our border. The money, the resources that we are employing can be used in a better way.
So they can be used in a better way. Right now, some of those people are being processed. What happens if they don't pass these tests? What happens if they are sent back after this 2,000-mile trek from Central America?
Well, many people are really in danger. When they go back, they are marked men and women because they are fleeing from conditions of violence that we as a country have created with our policies. We do have a responsibility because the economy is global, and our responsibility has to do because our economic policies do have a direct impact in creating the violent conditions that many of these people are fleeing from.
And the reality is if you fail your credible fear interview, potentially not because of your fault, it could be because you are not having the opportunity to actually share your story, because a lot of the story causes re-traumatization. And then you unfortunately go to an immigration judge who hears your appeal and denies it, and you're denied an opportunity, a final step, which is a request for reconsideration. Like many of the individuals I saw when I was working in a detention center, volunteering to prepare people for those interviews, you can be placed on a plane and sent back to your country of origin. And if an individual actually does have a credible fear, the nightmare scenario could be that person could be wrought from the violence.
So you actually prepared people for these interviews. How difficult is it to give a winning interview?
It's extremely challenging in the sense that a lot of individuals are fleeing domestic violence, are fleeing gang-based persecution, are fleeing issues that, frankly speaking, are very difficult to talk about, let alone talk to a stranger for maybe 20, 30 minutes, or even someone like me when I had to prepare them for that particular interview. You have to be careful as a balance as an attorney to not re-traumatize the individual, but at the same time provide an opportunity for that individual applying for their credible or interviewing for their credible fear to demonstrate to the asylum officer that 10%, that scintilla, that enough information to be able to then process their claim. It's a balancing act, and a lot of individuals, unfortunately, because of the fact that they're fleeing and talking about horrific violence, may not be able to share their story in a tight, pressured, contained environment when they're in detention as well and taking care of their children.
Yeah.
So we saw those images of some of these asylum seekers on top of that fence. There is talk on the U.S. side that the reason it took so long to even talk to these people is because they just weren't prepared. And yet, we had troops sent over there. We've been talking about this for at least 2 weeks. How is it possible that they weren't prepared?
Well, it has a lot to do, people who were also organizing people are in need. When there is these violent situations, Mexico is also a violent country. We have to remember that. So the money that is being invested, I think it's being falls into the wrong hands, first of all, and is not invested wisely. And I think we are seeing this political climate being so hostile to any immigrant, to any people seeking some kind of relief, that the opportunities for people to find any relief, to organize themselves, are more and more hardened. Those conditions are more hardened for people just to merely have a decent way of even proposing or even preparing.
And briefly adding to that, we should have been prepared. We should have had, if we can prepare the National Guard for several states to come in and to continue this sort of more militarization of the border, we should have had officers go, because this is not only, this is the first caravan at the time. Multiple caravans have actually occurred every year, annually.
So if we could talk about this population, we have multiple caravans going up. We know that U.S. immigration officials are interviewing some people, but we also know that DOJ has charged 11 with misdemeanors. How is that charge likely to affect their case for asylum in the U.S.?
So if an individual actually gets charged with illegal reentry, it could mean potentially, I believe that's what those individuals, the 11 individuals,
yes,
were charged with. That means that at one time they have either been removed from the United States, have crossed the border another time.
At one time, not this time.
Not this time, because it's illegal reentry. So at this point, they have several options. One is for asylum. They do have an opportunity still to possibly present an asylum claim, but instead of a credible fear interview, they have something called a reasonable fear interview, and that's a higher bar. It has to be demonstrated over 50% of an opportunity to demonstrate that you actually have that fear to meet for asylum. There's also opportunities like withholding of removal or the Convention Against Torture, binding obligations that the United States has agreed to as a signatory to not necessarily remove people even if they've come back into the United States as a result of a removal.
Now, so much of this goes above a lot of people's heads, so can you just clarify a little bit? The misdemeanor, what exactly are they charged with?
So they're charged with something in the INA called illegal reentry, which means that they have for some reason, were at a prior instance in the United States, and they were charged by ICE with the misdemeanor crime of actually coming into the United States unlawfully, being then subsequently removed on a removal order.
So they were deported.
Deported. They were removed, and then the individual wants to come back, and it could be the reason why the individual decides to come back and into the United States is because they do have a fear due to some sort of asylum ground. So they have an opportunity to come back. There are standards that the United States does need to meet to allow that individual an opportunity to present their case. In some circumstances for asylum, it's much higher than it would be a credible fear interview, but there are opportunities. Simply turning somebody away because they've come into the United States before, unlawfully, were removed, and are seeking asylum now is not correct.
So there's this notion that these folks, they came from Central America, they're largely not Mexican. Why can't they have refugee status in Mexico as opposed to actually coming to the USA?
A lot of individuals actually, the caravan started as much more of a massive group of people. Some individuals actually have decided not to come into the United States for whatever reason, for a variety of reasons. So some individuals can seek some sort of refuge in Mexico. Other people decide to come into the United States because they feel that they would be safer in the United States. They may have connections in the United States. They may want to be reunited with family in the United States. But the base analysis of why they are leaving their country is because of the idea that they have a credible fear that if they were to live in their country, they would be persecuted.
So, Juan Carlos, there were some demonstrations here in New York on Wall Street. What do we make of them?
I think we need to be divesting from these. You know, a lot of the jails, a lot of the detention centers are being driven by the profit margins. And I think we need to highlight that that many people.
And that's what the demonstrators wanted to do. They were following that money trail to Wall Street.
That's right. And I think we need to abolish. I mean, you have this layer in your police or policing. You know, $20+ billion budget a year. Why? I mean, we have the largest private army here in New York, 34,000 NYPD. You know, why do we need this extra policing from the federal government? They are not doing their job. You know, we need to ask really how we are investing our money, you know, and the cost to our humanity. We really need to highlight that.
They're a huge cost. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you, Ernie Collette of Mobilization for Justice and Juan Carlos Ruiz of the New Sanctuary Coalition. Thank you.
Thank you.